The U.S. remains the largest arms exporter in the world. From 2016 to 2020, it supplied arms to 96 countries, more than any other supplier. This fact may not be all that surprising given its military might. It is, however, interesting to note that the ever-growing military-industrial complex makes the U.S. military the biggest employer in the U.S. Let's unpack this with political analyst Professor John Stremlau. Prof, thank you so much for making time. Do these figures surprise you, or do they explain or even indicate what we already know?
They indicate what we already know, and your reference to the military-industrial complex is an important one because 60 years ago, Dwight Eisenhower, who was then president but was the commander-in-chief during World War II, warned the nation about the power of the military-industrial complex in his farewell address to the nation. And here we are in 2021, and we find that, in fact, the White House is requesting a $753 billion budget for 2022 for the Defense Department, which is the only discretionary big ticket item in the U.S. budget these days, because most of the items that are discretionary are really small. Congress tends to control most of that spending, but they're very generous on a bipartisan basis to the Pentagon, because the Pentagon remains fairly popular within the U.S. What happens after Afghanistan is another question, but there are many aspects of this problem of the military-industrial complex.
Does that perhaps explain as well the figures that I mentioned earlier, why the U.S. continues to deal with the issue of gun violence?
Well, gun violence is rooted in domestic politics, and I could talk for a good long time about the Second Amendment, which allows everyone to carry guns. It's rooted in the slavery history of the United States, which is a despicable history. But on a more positive note, what you find in the military exports is that the U.S. has companies, big companies like Northrop and Lockheed Martin, that sell to the world, as you mentioned, 90 countries. And the private companies sell far more weapons than do the government give weapons. $50 billion in military sales from the government, and $124 billion, to show you almost three times as much from private corporations. South Africa trades very heavily in military equipment relative to the size of its economy. It's only $37 million a year, which is a tiny proportion of the U.S. defense budget. And the U.S. defense budget is bigger than the next 11 nations combined. China is the second largest, but it goes right down the list through Russia and the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia and others. And that $761 billion is more than all those combined.
Yeah. Almost half of the U.S. arms transfers, we're talking here about 47%, went to the Middle East. And we know of the conflict that we've witnessed over the years in the Middle East. What would you say has been the impact of this transfer of arms in that part of the world?
It's hard to say, but what I would like to say is that weapons are a grammar to the political dynamics between and among countries. South Africa has put a lot of premium on diplomacy. Biden is now talking about diplomacy. We saw how impotent the investment of the U.S. in the military of Afghanistan was. It collapsed in a day or two. And that was a 300,000-man modern army, so-called, and it was supposed to be able to withstand the Taliban, but it didn't. And in the Middle East, you've got Saudi Arabia. You go where the money is, and that's where the budget for buying arms. South Africa sells military hardware to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Republics, I think, are among the largest of the purchasers of South African equipment. It's got the money. What it does, though, is it doesn't affect the fundamentals of the conflicts, which are now increasingly localized and subject to mobilization of people, not weapon systems. We saw that in Afghanistan, and we'll see it again in repeated situations around the world.
Mm-hmm. When we're talking about the U.S. being the exporter, are they selling these arms to the respective governments, or are they also selling it to the various organizations in the respective countries?
No, they're selling it basically to governments, and governments are eager always to buy more equipment to protect their own power base domestically and regionally. And South Africa sells to many African governments, as does the United States, but African governments don't have that much discretionary money compared to, say, the Saudi Arabias or the other wealthy Gulf countries. But also, you know, NATO and Russia and China. China's building up its military as it makes a bid for major power status. I just have to question the utility of military force in today's world of cyberspace and cyber warfare and low-intensity conflict and asymmetrical wars, and you can go down the list, and you begin to wonder, is the U.S. just preparing itself for the last war and not for the next wars? The threats we face today are very different, including from climate change or COVID, for heaven's sake. So what's the utility of all this money being spent on military weapon systems, which all of the countries in the world seem to engage in?
Yeah. Thank you for making time, Prof. Political analyst, Professor John Stremlau.